it's 4:30, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lucy Cheke today. As many of you know, Lucy has been in Cambridge a long time, right from the undergraduate, and did her PhD and then a postdoc with me and then a second one with John Simons and myself. And she became a lecturer, university teaching officer in 2015. And this academic year, she was appointed to associate professor. Lucy specialises in many things to do with cognition, both in animals and in human beings. Much of her early work was on memory and mental time travel and causal reasoning in animals and in humans. And she's continued some of those interests in her current projects in animal and AI. She's the director of Kinds of Intelligence at the Centre for Future Intelligence. And she's also been pursuing much of her work on mental time travel and then more recently other cognitive links with obesity and how obesity can lead to cognitive deficits. But today she'll be talking about a different topic, which is the effects of COVID on cognition. So with that, I'm going to unmute myself. I'd like us to all welcome Lucy, and over to you, Lucy.
Right, just swapping over sound. You just okay, can you see my slides okay?
Yes.
You need to mute. And you can hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Nikki, for inviting me. It's a real honour to be invited to give one of these. I've been attending them since 2006 as a little baby undergrad. And I hope that I can live up to the to the honour and to the challenge. So, oops, there we go. Those of you that are familiar with my work and familiar with the introduction that Nikki just gave might be a little confused to hear me introduce a talk entitled COVID and Cognition. You might quite legitimately be thinking, but I thought you studied obesity. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background of how I got into studying the association between COVID and cognition. For the last few years, I've been investigating the association between obesity and memory and how that links with a vicious cycle model of disrupted consumption and changes to the brain. I'm going to cut a long story extremely short by saying that what we found over the years was that there was indeed an association between increasing BMI and impaired memory performance. And we saw this across multiple measures of memory, but particularly measures of associative memory and the ability to bind different elements together in memory. This was reflected not only in behavioural performance, but in the measures in the brain. So we found reduced activity throughout the core memory network within the brain. Just realised I should set a timer for myself, and I will do that. This was reflected in those that were obese compared to those matched controls that were lean. So that's very interesting, but in the last few years I've been really trying to look into what is the mechanism of this. Why would we see a memory deficit in obesity? Obesity itself is defined in terms of excess adiposity, but it's actually associated with a whole host of other issues. And it could well be that this memory deficit that we see is associated with one of these other issues rather than body fat itself. At the kind of basic level, it could be that there are no memory issues at all. And what we see is in fact just a result of some response bias or demand characteristics that's different between lean and obese individuals. We could be looking at the effect of some behavioral correlates. So it could be exercise or diet that cause these memory deficits. And those are correlated with obesity, but obesity itself is not the thing. We can also look into neurobiological factors that would be causing this association. And of course, the answer is that it's a complex and nuanced mixture of all of the above. But what sort of complex and nuanced mixture? And I'm just going to go over this quite briefly. Apologies for the absolute mess that is this slide. But the first thing we wanted to make sure that this wasn't an artifact. Was it the fact that we were using food stimuli? Maybe obese people are more hungry. Maybe they're more impulsive, and there is evidence that obese people are more impulsive. And across a number of different studies, an ex-PhD student of mine and Nikki's, Kirsty Davis, showed that we could replicate this effect, that there was reduced memory performance in obesity across a number of contexts. Didn't matter what kind of stimuli we used, people could be fasted or fed, it would still show the memory deficit. There were memory deficit, effect between obese and lean among dieters and among non-dieters. And yes, impulsivity related to the performance, but actually didn't explain the BMI effect. So this fact that this memory deficits don't seem to be an artifact of something like differences in hunger gave us the confidence to move forward and start to look at what the underlying mechanisms are. Moving picture of Nikki in the corner out the way for me. So the next set of studies we went into, and this is something that I was writing up for publication before the pandemic began, was trying to really deep dive into these different variables. So we sent a group of participants away with a Fitbit activity monitor, a food diary, and we did a whole host of different measures of adiposity, including skin fold caliper measurements, body scans on the Tanita scale, and so on. And as well as a bunch of questionnaires on things like sleep quality and heart health. And we reduced, using factor analysis, these different variables into 4 main obesity-related categories: bodily adiposity, diet fell into 2 categories of carbs and sugar and dietary fats, and exercise. And again, I'm going to cut a very complex study very short and say that what we found was that depending on what memory variable you looked at, the model containing all of these obesity-related variables was always very highly significant. And it was either just dietary fats or dietary fats in combination with bodily adiposity that predicted these memory deficits. And that's even taking into account, unrelated demographic variables such as age, but also possibly very relevant things such as heart health, eating behavior, and sleep quality. So we definitely seem to be seeing this quite solid association between obesity-related variables and memory. But that's not a mechanism. We're still looking at correlations there. And there are a number of candidate mechanisms, and one that we looked into in particular was insulin. Both obesity, high-fat, high-sugar diets, and poor levels of exercise are all associated with impairments in insulin signaling. And insulin is sort of known for the good job it does in regulating sugar in the body, but it's also incredibly important in the brain. There are receptors throughout the brain, and they're particularly concentrated in the hippocampus and in the cerebral cortex. In fact, we can directly see the effect of insulin on memory by using intranasal insulin infusions, which actively improves memory immediately after infusion, and is actually being explored as a treatment for Alzheimer's. In our own work, we saw that, yes, actually, if we looked at insulin rather than obesity itself, we got a much clearer picture of what was going on. In the brain scanning study we did, if we split the sample by circulating insulin rather than by BMI, we got a much, much clearer behavioral effect of a reduced memory performance. We also got a clearer pattern of how these deficits emerged through structural equation modeling. The importance of looking at these mechanisms and things like insulin in particular is that, what my research has been looking at kind of moderately small memory deficits in young, otherwise healthy adults. But at a epidemiological and neurobiological level, insulin is known to be highly related to vulnerability towards cognitive decline, neurodegeneration, and dementia. Diabetes is regularly found to be associated with impaired memory, and often is a better predictor, as we've shown in our own work, of cognitive impairment than BMI itself. In fact, type 2 diabetes is associated with around a 10% increase in vulnerability to dementia and a worsening of cognition in those already suffering. You can't talk about insulin in this context without talking about inflammation. Chronic inflammation is now thought to be the key link between obesity and type 2 diabetes. Inflammatory markers correlate with insulin resistance independently of degree of obesity. And the impact of high-fat diet and hippocampal insulin signaling is inextricably linked with levels of circulating cytokines. If we look at the impacts of diet, the microbiome changes caused by high-fat diet and obesity lead to an inflammatory state which itself leads to peripheral insulin resistance. These two things are really, really, really closely related. And we know that inflammation has a huge role to play in regulating performance in the hippocampus. The increased neuroinflammation reduces neurogenesis and reduces the survival of newly formed hippocampal neurons. It disrupts neurotrophic factors, which are essential for neuroplasticity, and it also disrupts the integration of new hippocampal cells into existing networks. Once again, we come back to this idea of vulnerability to neurodegeneration and dementia. Inflammation has been repeatedly implicated in neurodegenerative processes, and actually you can directly link circulating cytokines with reduced episodic memory and increased Alzheimer's symptoms. So this is where I was a couple of years ago. I was writing a paper about the link between the obese syndrome and these candidate mechanisms of inflammation, insulin resistance, as well as something I haven't mentioned much, which is clotting and transient ischemic attacks and kind of silent strokes within the brain, and how these may lead to memory deficits as well as vulnerability to neurodegeneration. And that was March 2020. And then something kind of came up. And, you know, a lot of people were pivoting their research to COVID. And I even joked to someone, oh yeah, you know, I should look at memory deficits in COVID, thinking that was ridiculous. But then the papers started coming out. And it became clear that COVID wasn't just a respiratory infection. It was associated with a huge excess immune response, leading to cytokine storm, as it's called, in certain patients. There was a lot of association with increased blood clotting and increased numbers of patients reporting strokes. And all of these were beginning to emerge in stories of development of chronic inflammatory illness. And I was just kind of like, because that all looks exactly like the kind of profile of mechanisms that we were looking at in obesity. And so it raised the question that if we were looking at the same sorts of cluster of causal mechanisms that I was looking at causing memory deficits in obesity, then we might be seeing the same sorts of things post-COVID-19 infection. And if in turn this was similarly associated with vulnerability to neurodegeneration and dementia, or increased vulnerability to that, then that's something we probably needed to know. So I'm now actually going to start talking about COVID and cognition for real this time. So looking at COVID in the relation to cognition, this might come as a topic of surprise to a number of people. COVID is not something that we associated with cognition. So I'm going to do a brief tour of the literature for why we might expect to see cognitive deficits in COVID. And the first of these is the existence of neurological symptoms. We think of COVID as a respiratory disease that, you know, you can have symptoms ranging from asymptomatic to so severe that you require ventilation within the ICU. But in fact, around 35% of patients report neurological symptoms, including headache, dizziness, and the most well-known one, loss of taste and smell, and that's a neurological symptom. In severe illnesses, neurological symptoms can be seen in up to 85% of cases. And across the whole population of those within the infection, almost 80%, and this is in the early variants, were reporting loss of taste and smell. In fact, that's the first clinical symptom usually reported and often persists beyond any of the respiratory symptoms. It's the one that lingers. So there's a lot of evidence suggesting neurological symptoms are part of the COVID array, if you like. Are these associated with any evidence of neurological damage? Well, there's two ways of looking at this. First of all is the potential mechanisms via which we might expect to see neurological damage. And of these, there are unfortunately many. There are a number of ways in which the brain can be affected by COVID, both directly and indirectly. The direct route, the most obvious, if you like, is that the virus can get directly into the brain, likely via the olfactory nerve. And there is evidence for this. In autopsies, SARS RNA has been found in the brain, and it's been found in a number of different studies of the CNS. But there have also been a large number of autopsy studies that have not found that. So this suggests that this direct invasion of the brain of the virus is something that happens, but probably isn't sufficiently common to be explaining quite widespread neurological symptoms. Another way in which the virus can affect the brain is via depriving neurons of oxygen. Now, this can happen via the severe hypoxia and respiratory failure or distress that patients experience when they have really bad respiratory symptoms, but it also can happen via cerebrovascular issues. So if you have hemorrhagic or ischemic problems, so that's bleeding or blocking of the blood vessels within the brain, that can deprive neurons of oxygen. And there is plenty of evidence for thrombi and microthrombi in multiple organs, including the brain, and increased likelihood of stroke in COVID patients, particularly, to link back to the things we were discussing earlier, in those who are diabetic. There is also a substantial body of evidence now suggesting dysfunctional or excessive immune response in COVID. Even mild infections appear to cause significant brain inflammation. And the triggering of the microglia, so the brain's immune cells, appears very similar to those seen in neurodegenerative processes. Not everyone, but a significant subset of patients experience what's known as cytokine storm, which is an excessive cytokine release resulting in encephalopathy. And this seems to be long lasting. Studies in both humans and animals have found that these elevated cytokine levels continue for weeks or months after infection. So these are the sort of mechanisms by which you would expect to see visible neurological damage. And indeed, we do see that. In a number of case studies of severely ill COVID patients, we find that there are ischemic lesions found both in ICU patients and at autopsy, particularly in the orbital frontal cortex and the temporal lobes. The difficulty with these is that these are case studies of really very severely ill people. And it's difficult to know, firstly, whether or not it's this real severity of illness that's caused that, and or whether or not differences in the brain or underlying factors such as genes that lead to these differences in the brain are also associated with vulnerability to severe disease. So there is one study that's so far that has allowed us to look beyond these kinds of confounds. And this study was using the UK Biobank sample. The UK Biobank is a big ongoing study that takes regular measurements and particularly brain scans from a population of participants, all of whom are over 40, an average age of around 60. And this allowed this set of researchers to look at MRI scans before and after COVID infection and compare that longitudinally and with people who had and had not suffered COVID infection. They used both an ROI, region of interest, and an exploratory approach. And in the region of interest approach, they were exploring this hypothesis that the virus can directly enter the brain via the olfactory nerve. So they were particularly looking at areas of the brain that are either directly connected to the olfactory bulb or part of the olfactory cortex, or those with other close links, such as the insular and the orbitofrontal cortex. What they found was a pattern of consistent abnormalities. In the ROI analysis, they showed it was mostly in the left parahippocampal gyrus, specifically the perirhinal cortex. And this is an area known to be important for item and object memory and familiarity judgments, in the left lateral orbitofrontal cortex and the left superior insular. All of these differences were in measures of grey matter volume or thickness, and they were all in the left hemisphere. In the exploratory analysis, they found differences in 2 global measures of grey matter volume, and again in the left parahippocampal gyrus and the left orbitofrontal cortex. They had a small subset of patients who had been hospitalized. Most of them had had quite a mild illness. And when they compared the hospitalized and non-hospitalized patients, there were not very many significant results because it was a very small sample at that stage. But again, what they did find was differences in the left parahippocampal gyrus and the left cingulate cortex, but also in other memory areas, such as the hippocampus, amygdala, and cingulate cortex. So we're seeing evidence of neurological symptoms that may be associated with neurological damage. Are these associated with cognitive deficits? Is there any evidence for that? And it's at this point that I'm going to introduce a particular patient population. The National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, NICE, defines post-COVID-19 syndrome as signs or symptoms that develop during or after acute COVID-19, continue for more than 12 weeks, and are not explained by alternative diagnoses. Post-COVID-19 syndrome is what they call it. The term long COVID has now been increasingly adopted by patients, and now even more so now with academics and medics in this area. The difficulty with this definition is that signs and symptoms are not really ever defined or specified, and that makes this quite a difficult area to work within. However, the ONS estimates there are around 1.3 million people currently suffering from long COVID in the UK, of which around 500,000 have had symptoms for more than a year. The estimate is that around 10 to 25% of those that get a COVID infection go on to develop long COVID. However, the difficulty with those figures is that that's based on a list of 12 symptoms, none of which are neurological or cognitive in nature. One of the reasons that that's a problem is that it seems that cognitive deficits are one of the most common symptoms found in long COVID. Across a number now of large population studies of long COVID, we find that cognitive deficits, and generally specifically memory and concentration deficits, are among the top 3 most commonly reported symptoms. These also tend to be quite long lasting. So most of these studies, people don't report the cognitive symptoms in the early phase, in the initial illness. This is something that develops over time. So for example, Ziauddin and colleagues found that people reported cognitive symptoms as something that emerged after the acute phase. And that was explored in even more detail in Davis and colleagues' work that shows that rates of these cognitive difficulties increased across the first 8 weeks and then stabilized. And they tested across another 20 weeks and they didn't go anywhere across that time. Were there any particular cognitive issues that people experience? Well, it seems that other than much more kind of general terms such as brain fog or difficulty concentrating, that's hard to tie down to a particular cognitive area. The most commonly reported symptoms are memory problems and speech and language problems. These seem to be experienced across age groups with similar frequency, suggesting it's not an age effect per se, and that if you really narrow it down, particularly people seem to struggle with word retrieval. And this is having a big effect on people. 86% of participants in the study that asked about this indicated that cognitive dysfunction or memory deficits specifically was impacting on their ability to work. And around 30% of those reported being severely unable to work due to cognitive and memory deficits. So this is really a big deal for these individuals. There's a growing amount of research now looking at whether or not we can look at, if you like, objective cognitive deficits in post-COVID. 3 studies I'm showing here all looked at people who had been really very severely ill, and mostly older adults, although there were some younger adults in one of the samples. All of these found that there was really distinct cognitive deficits in patients coming out of ICU having had COVID. The difficulty is that we know that ICU itself is associated with severe cognitive issues, particularly if people have been in a coma or on a ventilator. So it's really hard to interpret whether these findings are a COVID-specific issue or really to do with just the severity of illness these people experienced? One study that helps us get at this question was a study by Hampshire and colleagues using the Great British Intelligence Test participants. Within that cohort, they were able to identify a subset who had tested positive for COVID and compare them to those that had not. They found significant cognitive deficits in terms of semantic problem solving, spatial working memory, and selective attention after controlling for age, gender, education level, income, and a whole range of different demographic factors. The size of the impairment for those that had been on a ventilator was huge. So something comparable to the difference in cognition between the ages of 20 and 70. But again, that's quite often expected when someone's been on a ventilator, that they're going to have some severe impacts from that. Potentially more concerning is that in those that experienced no respiratory symptoms, and they only measured respiratory symptoms, there was a small but detectable reduction in cognitive ability. Okay, so just to summarize this kind of whistle-stop tour of the literature, there does seem to be evidence of neurological symptoms, neurological damage, and cognitive deficits following COVID infection. But there are a number of outstanding questions. What is the nature of the cognitive impairment in long COVID? There's some evidence that there is one, and that people certainly feel like they experience those, but if most reported symptoms are to do with memory and language, is that where the biggest deficits lie? And can we make any associations between the reported symptoms and the cognitive outcomes? Can we, for example, identify a phenotype of long COVID that is particularly associated with cognitive deficits? Long COVID is incredibly heterogeneous. There's people that experience a tiny bit of fatigue, people who experience such severe fatigue they can't get out of bed, other people who are hospitalized with heart, lung, kidney, brain issues. Can we find a cluster of symptoms that is particularly associated with cognitive deficits, and if so, which? And can we from this make inferences about underlying mechanisms by looking at these symptom profiles? The COVID and Cognition study was something my team and I began in October 2020 to start to look at these issues. It's an online study that we did using Gorilla, and we recruited mostly via social media with some supplementation via Prolific, particularly for underrepresented demographics that we weren't really getting via Twitter, and designed in consultation with the long COVID support group and some recruitment from there as well. And we have a member of the long COVID patient community on our team. The general structure of the study was that people did a questionnaire where we got a lot of demographic details and some background health details, and then quite a detailed exploration of their experience of COVID. They then went on to do a number of cognitive tasks. This is a longitudinal study. I'm only going to talk about the initial session today, but we've actually followed these people up for a year. And so we'll be looking at how these symptoms change over time. Because of the timing in which people were in this study at the time were infected, most people hadn't had access to tests. So we included people who thought they'd had COVID regardless of test. But people who were currently ill with COVID, we basically said, come back in 3 weeks and we'll test you when you're not in the initial throes. And we follow people up about every 6 to 18 weeks, changing over time. The non-COVID group were followed up even more regularly than that, because we wanted to see, we were really aiming originally to do a before and after comparison with the people who might develop COVID during the study. But spoiler alert, nobody caught COVID, which is, I guess, good news. But I will just be presenting data from the initial session today. So just to go through the specific cognitive tasks we used 2 tests of memory. The first was a word list task. So you a standard, they see a series of words and then they're shown a word and they have to indicate whether or not it's old or new, whether or not it was on the list. A pictorial associative memory task where they saw a series of pairs of images and then was shown one of the pair and had to pick from a menu which item it was paired with. There were 2 kind of executive functions like tasks. One was the Wisconsin card sort, which is a test of task switching mostly, but a range of different executive abilities kind of contribute to performance on that. and visual working memory, which was a 2D mental rotation task, where they had to choose from a selection which item looked like a rotated version of the target item. And finally, based on feedback from the long COVID support group of the particular cognitive issues they were having, we added a semantic fluency, a semantic memory task called category fluency. In this task, you're presented with a category word like animals, and you're given 60 seconds to produce as many examples of that word as you can. This is normally a verbal task, and we did it in the written format. So what we did to try and mimic the sort of some of the challenges of the verbal format was to make it so that the text box only contains space for about 5 or 6 words. So after you kind of 6 words in, then you couldn't see anything that you'd said previously. So let's take a look at our sample. We had about 185, well, it's actually 185 people who had not suffered COVID infection compared with 181 people who had. These were more or less matched on age, education, and country of origin. There were some differences in age and education. The non-COVID group tended to be younger and less well educated, and that reflects that there were just more university students in that group. Looking at those who had COVID, our sample was relatively evenly split between those that had recovered completely by the time we came to do the test, those that reported that they still had ongoing mild to moderate symptoms, and those that reported that they had ongoing severe symptoms. And as you can see from this chart on the right, the actual, the greater number of our participants were actually more than 31 weeks post-infection. So we're talking about people who are, there were a few people that were in the first kind of 20 weeks, but most people were 6 months plus on from infection. So the first thing we wanted to do was to see if we could reflect the sorts of proportions of cognitive symptoms that we saw in those larger population-based studies. And we did see that of those in our sample that were reporting experiencing symptoms, that was about 126 people, we had around 78% were reporting difficulty concentrating, 69% reporting brain fog, 67 forgetfulness, 59 reporting tip of the tongue, which is ability finding words, or semantic defluency, which was saying the wrong word when you were trying to say something. So these proportions are very similar to other studies that I reported earlier on long COVID, which is encouraging because it allows us to be a little bit more confident that our smaller sample is broadly reflective of the bigger population. We also looked at the timing of these cognitive symptoms as well to try and understand whether or not we sort of aligned with those previous studies. And like those previous studies, we saw that people's reporting cognitive symptoms increased over time since infection. So on the left here, you've got the severity of cognitive symptoms across the entire time since infection. So for some people that might be 2 weeks, for others it might be 6 months. And on the right-hand graph, we've got the number of people reporting cognitive symptoms right now, so at the time of the study. And in both cases, we see that these increase the more weeks you are since infection. We then went on to look at the association between COVID status and these cognitive tasks that we did. And because we had a large number of variables associated with cognitive tasks, including percent correct, obviously, but also reaction time and other kind of measures of performance and error type and so on, we used factor analysis to reduce these down to 4 main variables. And the variables that came out were executive functions performance, which contained performance-related variables from the Wisconsin card sort and 2D mental rotation. Executive functions reaction time, which again contained reaction time related variables from these tasks. Memory, which memory, which contains all of the variables related to wordless performance and associative memory, and category fluency, which contained all of the variables associated with that category production verbal verbal task. So on to the main findings. The main and most consistent finding was that there was a significant reduction in memory performance in those that had had COVID versus those that had not. This effect was driven mostly by performance in the word list task, with slower reaction time and less and reduced performance. So throughout the next three graphs, there's going to be you can see two p-values. The black p-value will always be the p-value before correcting for multiple demographic factors. The green p-value is the figure after controlling for age, sex, education level, and country of residence. If we look more deeply into this memory deficit, we can see that it scales with severity of ongoing symptoms. We see, and you can see this most clearly in the memory factor on the left, that there is a gradual reduction in memory performance as severity of ongoing symptoms. So that's symptoms since the kind of recovering, if you like, from the initial infection increases. You can see on the right how this is reflected just in one particular metric from the individual tasks. So this is % correct in the word list and in associative memory. And we can see here that the effect is substantially stronger in word list than it is in associative memory. Associative memory does come out as significant once you control for demographic factors, but it's nowhere near as convincing. What about other factors? So COVID versus non-COVID, if we look at category fluency, looking at the factor, there's not really much there. There's a small effect there that's in both comparing group-wise COVID versus non-COVID and looking at the increased severity of ongoing symptoms, but that disappears once you take demographic variables into account. One of the one variable in the category fluency task that wasn't included in that factor was the number of times people repeated themselves when producing these category words. And that's because it didn't load with any of the factors. But if you look at that variable on its own, there is a consistent and reliable pattern of increased numbers of repetitions as firstly between the groups, and secondly, as you increase severity of ongoing symptoms. So this, to me, doesn't really seem like a category fluency variable per se, so much as a verbal memory variable. People forgot words that they had just recently said. In executive functions, we didn't really see much. There was an effect of reaction time, but not of performance. And that effect of reaction time dropped below significance when you controlled for demographic factors. So we're really looking at what looks like a verbal memory effect. We wanted to explore this more deeply and in more to kind of get a better understanding. And one way that we did this was to look at the symptoms people experienced. And we looked at these symptoms across 3 time periods. And this is one of those, like, remember this because it'll be important later moments. We looked during the initial illness, so those first 3 weeks where, you know, the kind of standard COVID period when you've got the initial illness. We then looked at 2 following periods, the ongoing illness, and that basically was in the entire time since that and since those first 3 weeks. So if you were 3.5 weeks since positive test, then it would just be that half week. But if you were 6 months on, it would be all of those 6 months since those first 3 weeks. We also looked at current symptoms, and this was defined as in the past 1 to 2 days. What are you experiencing right now at the moment that you take these tests? And what we wanted to look at was whether or not we could cluster these symptoms using factor analysis to reveal distinct phenotypes of long COVID, and whether or not these might give us some indication of the mechanisms underpinning cognitive impairments. So looking at initial symptom factors, first of all, the factor analysis revealed 5 main factors. The first one was neurological, so most characterized by disorientation, delirium, visual disturbances, confusion, and so on. The second one was really kind of mixed multi-system general factor, including, most characterized by fatigue, but also including things like chest pain and tightness, muscle and body pains, headache, limb weakness. There was then a gastrointestinal factor, including diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, and so on. And then a factor that I initially called classic COVID, but was overruled by co-authors, that was called respiratory/infectious, which has really got those symptoms that you really associate with COVID. And remember, this is the initial illness. So these are the kinds that you'd expect to experience these. So fever, cough, breathing issues, loss of taste and smell. And the final one was dermatological: rash, welts, sores, swelling. What we found, what we wanted to look at, was whether or not we could predict individual differences in, firstly, cognitive symptoms, and secondly, cognitive performance, by looking at association with these symptom factors. And now again, remember, this is symptoms during the initial illness, predicting cognitive symptoms or cognitive performance later on. So first of all, we found that ongoing cognitive symptoms, that is cognitive symptoms across the entire period since the initial illness, were significantly predicted by a model containing a number of these different symptom profiles, but particularly by the fatigue multi-system factor and the neurological factor, each of which on its own had quite a substantial effect size. Similarly, current, as in right now, in the last 1 to 2 days, cognitive symptoms were predicted by this same mixed fatigue-related factor. So we can see that we can predict how much people are experiencing cognitive symptoms right now, which can be 6 months later, by the type of symptoms they experience during the first initial illness in the first 3 weeks. We can also predict performance on cognitive tests using these initial symptom profiles. Both executive functions reaction time factor and the memory factor were significantly predicted by these symptoms, and each of these models contained only one factor. Executive functions was significantly predicted by the dermatological factor, whilst memory was significantly affected once again by this fatigue/multi-system mixed factor. We can see, if we look, so that's using the cognitive performance factors, but if we look at the individual tasks, we see a pattern of significance across multiple. But once you correct for multiple comparisons, very little kind of comes out, but there's a pattern of almost every single one being significant. So from these sorts of associations, we can speculate, and I emphasize speculate because this is an online study looking at symptoms, not a in-depth medical investigation, about the sorts of mechanisms we're looking at here. The symptoms within the fatigue mixed profile and the dermatological factor together really are reminiscent of the sorts of symptoms you see in chronic systemic inflammatory issues. In the mixed factor, we've got things like limb weakness, dizziness, and headache. And these sorts of things are very reminiscent of things like Guillain-Barré syndrome. In the dermatological factor, we have things like rash and swelling, and that really speaks of a body that's suffering particular inflammation. The symptoms within the neurological factor are much more sort of encephalitis-like in nature. They're much more kind of classic neurological symptoms. And so we might be seeing 2 examples of the different types of mechanism that might be leading to cognitive deficits within the initial illness. Looking at the ongoing symptom factors, now remember, these are symptom factors of across the entire time since initial infection. We have 5, factor analysis reveals 6 factors. Again, we have neurological, which contains many of the same symptoms that we saw last time. There's then a gastrointestinal/autoimmune, which is really characterized by things like hot flushes and dizziness, but also things like nausea and diarrhea. There's a cardiopulmonary and fatigue factor characterized by breathing issues, chest pain, fast irregular pulse, but also fatigue. Once again, a dermatological factor that also includes things like fever now, so really, continuing this kind of inflammatory angle. Appetite loss and weight loss was its own factor, as was mood-related things such as anxiety and depression. Once again, we looked at how these might predict cognitive symptoms and cognitive performance. First of all, looking at cognitive symptoms, we find a pattern that if we're looking at ongoing cognitive symptoms across the whole illness, that a model containing basically all of the symptoms, except dermatological, so except that really inflammatory one, predicted degree and severity of cognitive issues, and particularly this gastrointestinal / autoimmune and cardiopulmonary fatigue factors emerged. A very similar picture emerges when looking at currently experienced cognitive symptoms, that again, we're looking at this cardiopulmonary and fatigue related factor and the gastrointestinal autoimmune factor. We also have neurological mixed in there as well. Looking at cognitive performance, for the first time, we see something predicting executive function performance, and that's the neurological factor. And that on its own predicted variance in this factor. And we can see from the individual tasks, this is generally driven by differences in the Wisconsin card sort task. So if we now look at current symptoms, so symptoms that people have experienced across the last 1 to 2 days, predicting current cognitive symptoms and current cognitive performance, again, we see this cardiopulmonary and fatigue factor emerging, predicting cognitive symptoms. And again, we see the neurological factor predicting cognitive performance on tests. And this time it's predicting the memory factor rather than the executive functions factor. So we see across a number of different associations that we can predict some of the individual differences in not only the subjective experience of cognitive issues, but also objective measures of cognitive issues in those who've experienced COVID, sometimes up to 6 months previously. But we've been using cognitive symptoms as an outcome variable. Is it the case that those experiencing cognitive symptoms perform differently on these, if you like, objective tests of cognitive performance? And the answer is yes, but only for the currently experienced cognitive symptoms. So it doesn't really matter how much you've been experiencing cognitive symptoms in the whole length of your illness. It matters whether or not you are experiencing cognitive symptoms on the day you took the test. And that makes some logical sense. What we found particularly was that the cognitive symptoms factor significantly predicted variance specifically in the memory factor. People who are currently reporting more severe cognitive symptoms performed far worse on the memory tests. We can also break down the cognitive symptom factor into specific cognitive symptoms and their associated cognitive performance. So we looked, for example, at people reporting forgetfulness. And remember, all of these comparisons are within people currently experiencing symptoms, but just looking at those currently experiencing cognitive symptoms compared to those that are not. So those that said, yes, I'm experiencing forgetfulness, performed significantly worse on memory tests, and this was particularly driven by the word list task, compared to those who did have ongoing symptoms, but did not say, yes, I'm experiencing forgetfulness. Interestingly, there was no association between the more linguistic cognitive symptoms, such as tip of the tongue and semantic disfluency, and measures on the category fluency measures. But each of those did associate with, once again, word list memory. We also looked at these sorts of general cognitive symptoms, such as difficulty concentrating and brain fog. And again, we saw that they were associated with cognitive performance. Once again, the memory factor came out, but also the category fluency factor. The category fluency factor was particularly predicted by difficulty concentrating rather than brain fog, but there was definitely a difference there. So one of the things we wanted to look at more was all of these patterns seem to suggest that there is something going on with verbal memory. We're seeing a pattern where measures of word list performance is repeatedly coming out as something that's predicted. And we're also seeing that there is one particular factor within the category fluency task that kept coming up. And that was this measure of repeated words. That is to say, people forgot what they'd said 20 seconds ago. When we looked at the difference between people with ongoing symptoms who reported each of these different cognitive symptoms and those that didn't, across all of these different symptoms, we found a consistent pattern that those reporting cognitive symptoms of any kind were reduced, had impaired performance on word list and category fluency repetitions, compared to those that had ongoing symptoms and didn't report those symptoms, suggesting there's something quite consistent going on with verbal memory. So just to summarize, COVID infection does seem to be linked with cognitive deficits. That's been shown before, and in our work, it looks like this is really something particularly to do with verbal memory. The symptom profiles may suggest a contribution of systemic or neuroinflammation to the development of these issues, particularly during the early phase. And ongoing current neurological symptoms and neurological cardiopulmonary issues seem to be associated with current cognitive issues. And this may suggest, and I'm going to emphasize again that I'm speculating wildly here, that some sort of inflammatory response during the early stage may cause elements of damage that then themselves go on to cause cognitive deficits. And it's not necessarily the ongoing inflammation that causes the cognitive deficits so much as the damage caused by the early inflammation. This is much more an indication of where people who can really look at this with actual proper medical data should go and look, rather than a conclusion, but it certainly is an interesting pattern of the associations with symptoms across those periods. Importantly, those reporting cognitive symptoms show a clear pattern of deficits relative to those with ongoing symptoms who do not have cognitive symptoms specifically, which really suggests that reporting cognitive symptoms is an indicator of cognitive deficits in those patients. So these results are being published on the 17th of March across 2 papers, because it ended up being too long for one paper, in the journal Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience. If you can't wait that long, if you're just too excited, they are also currently out in preprint in medRxiv, and you can go and find them there right now. Why is this data important? It's important for those with long COVID for a number of reasons. First of all, there's just the sheer quantity of people suffering from long COVID. Over 1 million currently suffering, which is far less than the number of people who have suffered over the last 2 years, and goodness only knows how many will. Cognitive dysfunction is really commonly reported and is associated with an inability to function. If you remember back at the beginning of the talk, I was talking about large proportions in other studies showing that their reduced ability to work, and we find the same reflected in our own data. Around 38% of our sample reported long periods unable to work, 18% had lost their jobs, 12% reported financial difficulty, and 46% reported difficulty coping with day-to-day activities. One of the aims of this study was to facilitate patient self-advocacy. People reporting cognitive symptoms across, in long COVID or in a number of other situations, such as obesity, for example, tend not to be given cognitive assessments in GPs' offices or in clinics. I'm just going to say a thing that the mini mental state does not count. That may be very good at telling you whether or not someone is able to live independently, but it isn't able to detect even quite a significant reduction in previous ability in people who were previously healthy. There's a huge risk, therefore, of what's called testimonial injustice. People having their illness dismissed because they can't prove it. In fact, 33% of our sample reported difficulties getting doctors to take their symptoms seriously. Our data shows that people reporting memory and linguistic problems have noticeable, measurable impairments in these abilities, and that we should treat the reporting of those symptoms as an indicator of measurable deficits. In terms of the long-term risks, these data are important exactly for the reasons I was discussing at the beginning. All of the different candidate mechanisms via which COVID can cause neurological symptoms, neurological changes, and cognitive deficits are all things that have been previously indicated as part of the vulnerability to and the mechanistic processes involved in neurodegeneration and dementia. Inflammation, CNS invasion of a virus, dysregulated clotting, all of these have been indicated in the development of dementia. In fact, just recently, there was a paper suggesting that actually maybe up to 70% of dementias may, in fact, and this is before COVID, may be caused by transient ischemic attacks or small kind of silent strokes that have been missed. So this kind of, particularly these issues of clotting and inflammation, are incredibly important for us to understand and target at this early stage, just in case that there's some kind of long-term issues going on there. The reduced memory performance we see in our study, and combined with the loss of temporal lobe grey matter that's seen in the brain bank study, support this narrative of an increased risk of neurodegeneration and dementia. But you don't have to believe this data to be worried about that. There are actually a number of neural markers of degeneration and Alzheimer's-like pathology in COVID-19 patients, including amyloid beta aggregates and tau and tangles. And I could list all of these, but there are a lot. So there are a lot of reasons to be worried about this. There are also some reasons to be slightly hopeful based on our data. And again, you know, our data is a relatively small sample, but what we saw generally was that those that said they had recovered, that to them had recovered. They were indistinguishable cognitively from people who had not had COVID. So I think that gives a little a ray of hope, at least, that it's not all doom and gloom forever. So what's next? So I mentioned that we will be following up these patients. We've finished following them up. We've been following them up for a year now. And we're going to do some explorations of not only how these symptom profiles change over time. So some of our participants will have had long COVID for nearly 2 years now, but also what's really interesting and what's really notable, I should have mentioned this earlier, is that this sample were almost all unvaccinated. This was October 2020 that we started this study. And what's a real kind of boon for this data set is that the majority of them received a vaccine within the year in which we were following them up. So this gives us an opportunity to look at what the influence of post-infection vaccination has on these cognitive symptoms and how they associate with other symptoms. We're also now recruiting the next wave of this study. And if you're interested in taking part, there is a QR code that you can scan and a link that you can follow. And this next wave is going to be fine-tuning these cognitive tasks to really try and get at what precisely is there within this verbal memory deficit. Is it a verbal deficit that happens to spill over into memory? Is it a memory deficit combined with a verbal deficit? What are we seeing there precisely? We're also recruiting from clinics now, the post-COVID clinic and the NHS staff mental health clinic within Adam Brooks Hospital. And importantly, we're going to be looking at the influence of pre-infection vaccination on the development of these cognitive tasks. And just some good news on that area, literally published in preprint today, was one of the first kind of in-depth investigations on whether or not there is reduced likelihood of developing long COVID after having a vaccination. And good news is that it looks like there's about a 40% reduction in the chances of developing long COVID. So that's huge. That's excellent news. And that literally came out as I was writing this talk today. Many reasons for hope. The other study that we're starting is looking at long COVID in children. There's growing evidence that whilst long COVID isn't quite as common following infection in children, it's still there in around kind of 3 to 15% of cases. A large number of children are currently suffering from long COVID, particularly in the UK and other places, and the UK are not vaccinating these children. So we've had a huge amount of infection over the last couple of months, and it's really important that if there are cognitive impacts of that we understand those and we understand them quickly. So if you have children that want to take part, you can follow the same QR code and the same link. So that's basically it from me. This work has been unfunded, which means that we've been incredibly reliant on a wonderful team of collaborators, students and volunteers. And I want to say an absolute heartfelt thank you to each and every one of them, particularly my PhD student Pan and Sabine and Alvaro, the visiting students. Lynn Curtis is our patient representative from the long COVID support community, who has been invaluable both as a representative, but also she's a psychology student at Exeter, so she's brought those skills as well. And there were 2 undergraduate students, Ruby and Arca, who worked on the data set that I've presented. The collaborators Mark Haggard and Muzaffar Kaiser have also been invaluable. Mark really helped with the factor analysis and getting all of that working, and Muzaffar is the clinical lead on the project. So with that, I want to say thank you to Nikki for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you for all of you for listening, and sorry for being a bit depressing. Thank you very much.
Can everybody hear me now?
I muted myself.
No worries. Thank you for a wonderful talk, Lucy. A fascinating research. At the end, you mentioned this very recent finding about a 40% reduction in the tendency to develop long COVID after vaccine. Does that apply to any kind of vaccine, or is that specifically triple vaccinated? And Lucy, I wonder if it might be easier for you to come and use my computer to answer the questions rather than keep switching between the two. So do you want to come and take my chair?
So I need to show some on the slide.
Yes. And I'll move my notes. So there you go, you've got some specs there.
See a big picture of Greg's face. Hi, Greg.
There you go.
The answer to that specific question is actually I don't know. The preprint was released about 25 minutes before I came out, and I've not read it. But that was the abstract, and it's published by some people that I very much trust. So hopefully that's not wrong. But yes, I don't know about, we don't know to what extent that is reflected in cognitive issues or kind of cognitive symptoms. So that's kind of yet to be seen. And that's one of the things we'll be focusing on. So someone asked in the chat, are cognitive impairments specific to COVID or similar effects seen in post, in other long-term issues following infection? It's difficult to say, actually. So we know that long-term illness is not unique to following COVID. There is long-term illness following a whole host of different viruses and respiratory illnesses. But they have been woefully understudied, and we just don't know. There is some evidence of cognitive issues in ME, for example, and diseases such as E. coli, for example, has been really investigated because of its huge inflammatory issues, of the huge inflammatory response it causes. But the understudying of this phenomenon makes it really difficult to answer that question in full. But I would suspect that there will be variants, but there will be some similarities, yeah. COVID is a bit special in its combination of factors. The clotting and the inflammation together seems to be quite unique to a sort of SARS-like illness. So there's reason to believe it might be worse than other kind of ongoing issues. John.
Thanks, Lucy. Fascinating talk, and really brilliant and hugely important research, I think. I was interested particularly in the relationship between the sort of subjective reports of symptoms and your objective measures of actual sort of cognitive deficits, and wondered if you'd had a look, or whether you've thought of having a look at the influence then of sort of metacognition on these effects. Because you can imagine a situation where, if I feel ill, if I feel fatigued, if I think that I am ill, that's going to definitely have an influence on my abilities to perform well on these sorts of demanding cognitive tasks. And we know in particular, of course, that memory is particularly, influenced by metacognitive effects. So whether you'd thought of looking at confidence measures and seeing whether there's more of a correlation or different correlation between something like confidence measures and actual objective measures of accuracy in these groups compared to the groups who didn't have COVID, for example.
Yeah, it's a really important question. It's a really difficult one to get at without kind of a really targeted investigation of that. We did look at how severely ill people felt on that day. So we got them to rate how bad, basically we said, how bad is it today? From, very bad to actually I'm loads better than I normally am. And we didn't actually find a significant association between that and cognitive performance. Suggesting that obviously that doesn't get at your question directly, but that's one thing we looked at to try and reassure ourselves slightly that it wasn't just, I'm just so tired today, I can't do this. The other thing we looked at was comparing those that reported, those that report specifically, something like a memory symptom or a word finding symptom, as you say, like across the different specific types of cognitive task. So, because you would expect to have a sort of generally reduced performance across everything in those reporting cognitive symptoms. And again, you're right, memory is possibly more vulnerable to that than executive functions. So there may be kind of natural inherent differences there. But we did see that there were kind of differences in where the deficits were, and that they were quite well tied to the specific difficulties people were having. But it's a really good point. We don't have the measurements of competence and so on to address that, and I think it probably is a contributing factor. I don't know quite how we can add that without substantially. I think that's something that we should look at into it specifically. But it's a really it's a tricky circular thing. Kylie.
Hi, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I just had a question that occurred to me. I wondered whether you had looked at, you mentioned obviously that you had measured asked people to measure their own symptoms at these particular time points, but I wondered whether you had measured their behavior during their COVID infection. So I'm just thinking, for example, the difference between somebody who had the, shall we say, luxury of being able to go to bed for a week and rest and relax and do all of the things that a doctor might advise, compared to somebody who's looking after 4 children and a husband who've all got COVID as well, plus the elderly relatives, plus etc., and frankly doesn't have the option of stopping and is just carrying on as best they can and getting through it. And whether you asked those questions, and if you did, whether that showed anything interesting.
For sure, and it's a really important point. Other studies have shown that there are kind of 3 big risk factors for developing long COVID. Being a woman, being under 60, and you can't do anything about either of those, but the third one is resting. And anecdotally, those that kind of got up and exercised too soon are those that ended up suffering more. And there is increasing evidence of that. And that's just not something we knew about at the time that we were conducting this study. So no, we didn't have questions about that. It's something that we're trying to look at more in the follow-ups, along with kind of some more kind of subtleties about particularly this issue that it may be affecting women more, although we didn't actually find that in our data, other people have. So no, we didn't, and I think it's probably a really significant factor.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? There's one more. Tristan, got his hand up.
Hi, sorry I came late. I was running around between kids and all the other stuff. But I was actually looking at the Med archives, which was, I was completely drowning in the ridiculous amount of work you've done, which was actually good, because then I drown and then you fish me out by giving the talk. In this amazing amount of studies that the people launch, in 2020 until now, from the COVID minds that you're part of, and other sort of metadata, there is really not that much about really good cognitive ones, I must say. So this is really refreshing coming from you, because we have you near, so we can ask you more stuff. So I have 2 questions. Most of the studies are related to self-rated, aspects of, negative, things in life, right? So it's mainly anxiety and loneliness and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some others are slightly more, encompassing. So my question is, how do you relate your detailed, analysis on cognition and neurological symptoms, no matter if they are, online study or what, because all of the others are online. How is it your cognitive like and neurological relations that you found to the classic psychology ones that has been sort of reported, which is that the bulk of them are related to that, right? Loneliness, anxiety, etc. That's first question. I'll wait until you tell me, and I have the other one.
All right.
Okay.
Mustafa is our resident mental health guy, and there's definitely a complex association between the cognitive element and the mental health element, and that's something we're really exploring in more detail in the follow-up, and he can speak to that a little bit more. But first of all, I will say that we have records of who had pre-existing mental health issues, so anxiety and depression and other, in the kind of pre-existing medical questionnaire, and we didn't find much of an effect of that. And we also looked at newly developed anxiety and depression post-infection, and we actually had a section in one of the papers where we compared people who had an illness that was not COVID during lockdown versus people who had an illness that was COVID during lockdown, and the ongoing symptoms in those two groups. And yeah, both of them experienced anxiety and depression and coughs. But actually we see that there were a huge number of symptoms that were specific to the COVID cohort, rather than the I had an illness and it was lockdown but it wasn't COVID sort of thing cohort. And most of those were cognitive. And that's partly because I think, people get coughs, and ongoing coughs after an illness is incredibly common. So it's not a very discriminatory, not very, it doesn't do a kind of a differential diagnosis very well. But it's also partly, I think, because we may be seeing something kind of quite particular there. But yeah, I think it probably interacts quite substantially with mental health. I don't know if Muzaffar, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, what I can say is it's complicated. So I think what we will try to do is when we start recruiting people from the staff mental health service, people presenting with mental health problems, and we ask them about their COVID status. And in my own experience, we ask everyone about how they were with COVID. So there is a significant group of people who have been working in the wards and working with COVID patients, but never had COVID, because these are people who also had asymptomatic testing as well. So we're sure that they didn't have any COVID. So I think we will have a much more refined comparison, people who are presenting with depression, anxiety, who had COVID and who we absolutely know that they haven't COVID. So I think that would be one way to approach that, and this is what we do with our sub-study. So we got the ethics approval. We're just waiting for the R&D thumbs up to start. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. It's the power of the global experiment, right? That you can suddenly find people who have been exposed and never had COVID.
It was people who had COVID we were struggling with in the first round, and now it's people who haven't had COVID that's is more of a struggle.
Yeah, that's a bit sad. But my second question was coming back to your mention of the big massive study from Adam Hampshire and collaborators, and how that really relates, from this 80,000 people study, but the cognitive tasks don't have so much detail, right? And the statistics are completely different how you run them. So I'm asking you, since you read the study and you did yours, I think it's like, what's the conversion between a massive study and a more detailed, follow-up study that you're doing? What do you find commonalities and differences?
Bit of panic when that came out. That they'd just done the same thing but much better. No, but it's quite different but complementary, in fact. So there were like 80,000 people in the study, but only about 300 have actually had COVID. So the sample of COVID was actually much smaller. And they didn't ask about symptoms at all, apart from respiratory symptoms. So they basically had one question that asked about severity of symptoms. And it was all about respiratory symptoms, going up to I was on a ventilator down to I have no respiratory symptoms. And then they just said, do you still have that symptom? And people said yes or no. So that from that, people said no, and they said, oh, well, people have recovered. So it wasn't a long COVID study, it was a post-COVID study, and they didn't really look at ongoing symptoms at all. They also did, yeah, standard neuropsych battery, which is, I think, incredibly useful for looking at sort of patterns of issues, but not as useful for kind of really deep diving into what they are, cognitively speaking. And there were, there's definitely overlaps there. They kind of found difference in attention and some measures of working memory. And interestingly, we did overlap on the mental rotation task, and we both found no difference in mental rotation. So that was reassuring. There's been a big study just done by Oxford that's just been released in the last couple of weeks, which I haven't had time to like really deep dive into for this talk. But again, I think that it's again a similarities and differences thing, that they're not looking at long COVID quite so much, and not diving into the kind of associations with symptoms quite so much, but this should help us triangulate about what we're looking for.
Are there any other questions? Can't see anything in the chat, Lucy. Just thank yous. No. Well, if there are no further questions, I'd just like us all to thank Lucy for a really wonderful, beautifully presented, fascinating results and really inspiring work. Thank you, Lucy. So big thank you.